In many recipes, such as sausages, burgers, and meatloaves, mincemeat is always formed into a solid chunk, in other words, a meatball. But not all meatballs are the same, and it is very intriguing how different techniques can be used in handling meat to yield those differences. Let's look at how burgers are handled, for example. It's always do not overwork your burgers. You should not handle it too much because it will become tough and dry. But if you look at a sausage recipe, for example, this recipe by Simply Recipe tells you to knead the meat, which to me sounds a lot like overworking your meat. So let's test it out today. How does handling meat differently affects the texture or even the taste of the meat? So firstly, I divide 2 equal parts of minced meat into 2 different bowls. And then I put the labels on it. Green equals the worked mince, and yellow is the unworked mince. So now I'll start working the green mince meat. What I am doing here is chopping it with the back of the knife, which effectively is kneading the meat in a way that is pretty aggressive, more aggressive than just mixing it by hand, because there's a lot of blunt force that I'm applying here. But the reason why I am using the back of the knife is that I am actually not chopping the meat into finer pieces, but I am only applying force to the minced meat. While doing research about working minced meat, I could not find any research about the changes that minced meat goes through when it is quote-unquote kneaded. I did, however, find a lot of explanations by people online for that change, most of which point to myosin as a key factor in the change in the texture of minced meat when it is worked. An article on meat emulsions on the Ohio State University reads, myosin, the major structural protein of meat, is the most important of the proteins for fat emulsification and water-holding capacity of processed meats. It is believed that myosin may bridge the oil-water interface as the non-polar amino acid residues of the myosin tail would be attracted to the fat cell surface, while polar amino acid residues of the myosin head would be associated with the water phase. Meat emulsions are more commonly known as meat batters, which are finely processed batches of homogeneous minced meat. In contrast, for example, burgers are considered coarsely ground. The meat and fat particles are still discernible. Well, the meat batter is not really an emulsion. Here is an excerpt written by K.O. Honekel from the Encyclopedia of Meat Sciences examining it. Such a colloidal system is called a suspension. A part of the protein structures of the dissolved proteins have changed their three-dimensional structures, and they have become partially more lipophilic. They try to form a protein net or skin around the fat particles. The modified protein structures entrap the fat particles already during the chopping process. On heating, the dissolved and undissolved or dispersed protein molecules and particles form a three-dimensional network in which fat droplets and water are entrapped, bound, or immobilized. A complicated colloidal system is formed which cannot be called an emulsion in any state. As a consequence of the entrapped fat particles, the meat batter becomes a heat-stable, three-dimensional network of which little or no water and fat cookout occurs. Actually, from the same article on Ohio State University by Lynn Knight mentioned above, we have, as chopping continues, emulsion temperatures cause the surface tension of the fat particles to decrease. This decrease in surface tension further enhances the particle reduction process and rapidly increases the surface area of the fat particles. As the surface area increases, more protein is required to form the protein layer that surround the fat globules. Thus, we can conclude the effect of the protein structures around fat globules are more pronounced the further it is chopped down. This is just my hypothesis, but the act of kneading meat doesn't change the texture of minced meat. Rather, it's turning fat globules into smaller pieces that changes it. When mixing meat, we're actually shredding the pieces of minced. The effect is not as drastic as chopping it, but it still causes quite a significant change. That's why many people think that when you knead the meat, you are actually working the meat and changing its texture. While it is true that the texture does change, the real underlying reason why, I think, is the shredding of the fat particles, as mentioned above, not the physical force that we are applying to the minced meat. Nevertheless, my hypothesis has not been proven, since the test I am doing is just preliminary. Whatever the case, let's look at the result of my quote-unquote experiment. Here I have 3 pieces of meat on each dish. The shape of the meatball across the 2 dishes are the same. Everything else but whether or not it is worked is mostly controlled. Mình thấy khác nhau điểm nào?
Bé này có vẻ khô hơn.
Khô hơn à?
Bên nào khô hơn.
Thử ăn 2 miếng kia đi, thử ăn so sánh giữa 2 miếng to to với nhau.
Cái này mềm ấy.
Hả?
Miếng này bên này lại mềm hơn.